Linda Cole, 63 years old, and I've spent most of my life scrubbing other people's floors for a living. I never expected luxury, not at my age. But that Saturday morning, I stood in the lobby of a 5-star hotel in downtown Chicago, feeling like I'd stepped into a dream I wasn't meant to touch. My son, Ethan, had invited me there, told me it was his way of saying thank you for everything I'd done for him. He said those words with such warmth that I let myself believe him, even though something in me trembled like it always does when life feels too good. The marble floors gleamed so brightly I could see my reflection bending at my feet. The scent of fresh lilies drifted from a vase taller than I was. I kept smoothing the wrinkles of my old cardigan, hoping no one noticed how out of place I felt. Ethan walked beside me with a confidence I never had, and for a moment I thought maybe I had finally raised a man who wanted to give back, even just a little. But all those soft thoughts shattered when we reached the checkout desk. The manager read the total with a polite smile, as if $11,000 were nothing but a number printed on paper. Ethan leaned in, hugged me tightly, and whispered, "Thanks for the stay, Mom," before slipping out of my arms so fast I barely felt the warmth of him. I watched him walk away, not once looking back. Marissa hurried after him, her heels clicking like punctuation marks to a sentence I didn't understand yet. My throat closed as the manager cleared his voice, waiting for my card. I told him there had to be a mistake. He said there wasn't. And then a new voice, softer, older, drifted from behind the counter. "Ma'am, are you the daughter of Harold Price?" I hadn't heard my father's name spoken aloud in over a decade, but in that single instant, standing there broke and abandoned, I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if this wasn't just a hotel bill, it was the beginning of something far bigger and far darker. The moment the manager stepped aside, the older woman from behind the counter moved closer. Her voice was gentle, but it cut straight through the fog of panic spinning inside my head. She asked again if I was the daughter of Harold Price, and for a second all I could do was stare at her name tag, at the way her hands rested on the counter as if she had been waiting all morning for me to walk through those glass doors. My father's name tasted strange in my mouth. I told her he'd died years ago and asked why she was bringing him up now. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked the manager if she could take her break early, then looked at me with eyes that felt far too knowing for a woman I'd never seen before. She guided me toward a small staff room behind the desk, a narrow space with a microwave, a coffee pot, and the kind of chairs that squeak when you shift your weight. I sat down because my legs felt too weak not to. She introduced herself as Margaret Green and handed me a paper cup filled with lukewarm tea. I tried to drink it, but my fingers shook too badly. All I could see in my mind was Ethan walking out of the lobby without turning back. I kept replaying the way his arms felt around me when he hugged me goodbye, the false warmth of him, the way it evaporated the moment he stepped away. Shame spread across my skin like a fever. I couldn't understand why he'd do something so cruel, why he'd watch me stand there helpless in front of strangers. Margaret waited until my breathing steadied before she spoke again. She told me she used to work for my father when she was younger, that she'd known him in a way my mother never had the chance to. I didn't understand what any of that had to do with the bill sitting on the counter outside, the bill my son had just handed me like a loaded weapon. But Margaret's expression held something heavier than curiosity, something almost like regret. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with Scotch tape yellowed around the edges. My father's handwriting stretched across the front of it, faded but unmistakable. Seeing it punched the air from my lungs. I hadn't seen that handwriting since the week he died, when I'd sorted through the last of his belongings, old tax returns, a pair of cracked reading glasses, a wallet with nothing but expired coupons inside. He'd lived so simply, or at least that's what he let us believe. Margaret said he had instructed her to give me that envelope only if I ever showed up at the hotel looking lost, desperate, or in trouble. I couldn't understand how he'd predict something like this. I couldn't imagine him planning anything for me, not after the years of silence between us. Yet here I was, sitting in a hotel staff room with a stranger who seemed to know more about my past than I did. I held the envelope in my lap, my fingers tracing the edges while my heart pulled tight in my chest. Every instinct screamed that opening it would change something I wasn't ready to face, but at the same time, it felt like the only lifeline in a morning that had gone horribly wrong. Before I could tear it open, the manager knocked on the door, reminding me I still had a bill waiting outside. His voice was polite, but I heard the pressure beneath it. I told him I needed a moment, and when he left, Margaret leaned closer and explained that the hotel couldn't release me without a plan of payment. They weren't trying to be unkind, it was simply how the system worked. I'd spent my life avoiding debt because I knew I could never climb out of it, and now here I was, buried under a number I couldn't even comprehend. Margaret touched my arm lightly, as if to steady me. She said she could talk to her supervisor and arrange for a temporary hold, but it wouldn't last long. I felt my throat close again, and for a second, I wondered if this was the moment everything in my life finally came crashing down. But then my hands tightened around the envelope. Something in me whispered that before I let this hotel swallow me whole, I needed to know what my father had left behind. Maybe it wasn't anything important. Maybe it was nothing more than an apology written too late. But a part of me, a quiet, stubborn part, shaped by years of surviving more than I ever should have, told me that whatever was inside mattered. I slid my thumb under the seal, and in that cramped little staff room, surrounded by humming appliances and the distant chatter of hotel guests, I began to read the words that would unravel everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me and the son who had just walked away. The letter inside the envelope was written in my father's uneven cursive, the kind he used when he was tired or rushing. I hadn't seen that handwriting in more than a decade, but it reached inside me the moment my eyes touched it. He began by saying he knew I had every right to hate him, that he deserved nothing from me, not forgiveness, not remembrance, not even a moment's grief. He wrote about the lies he'd told my mother, about the second life he'd built, a life filled with secrets I was never meant to uncover. And then he told me there were documents stored in a locker near Cleveland, a place where he had kept the paperwork he was too ashamed to bring home. At the bottom of the letter, he'd taped a small brass key with a number etched on one side, Unit 114B. I folded the letter slowly, feeling the edges of my world shift. My father had lived like a ghost drifting through my childhood, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. He never raised his voice, rarely drank, but there was always a silence around him, thick enough to choke on. Now, sitting alone with Margaret in that staff room, I realized that silence had been hiding something far bigger than I ever imagined. Margaret watched me closely as I slipped the key into my pocket. She said she didn't know what was in that unit. Harold never told her, but she believed he truly wanted me to find it. I nodded, even though my mind was spinning so wildly I could barely process her words. The bill still waited outside the door, like a stone tied to my ankle. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun the shame Ethan had left me with. But before I faced the lobby again, I asked Margaret if she had seen Ethan leave. She said she had, and that there had been no hesitation in him, not a single glance back in my direction. Hearing that felt like being punched in the ribs. I'd raised that boy alone after his father died in a factory accident. I'd taken extra shifts to pay for his school field trips, sold my wedding ring when he needed a laptop for high school, stayed up nights sewing patches onto his jeans because I couldn't afford replacements, and yet he walked away from me like I was nothing more than a debt he didn't want anymore. I returned to the lobby with the envelope in my hand and asked the manager what my options were. His tone stayed professional, but I could see the discomfort in his eyes. The way people look when they're watching someone else's misfortune but can't do anything about it. He offered a structured payment plan, something that would still take me years to settle. I signed the agreement because I had no other choice. And when I left the hotel, the morning sun felt harsher than before, the city louder, meaner. On the train ride back to Ohio, I kept the envelope open on my lap, rereading the letter as if the words might suddenly rearrange themselves into something less painful. But they didn't. My father admitted his mistakes plainly. He had owned property, more than one building, and he'd kept it all hidden. He wrote that he couldn't bring himself to leave anything to me while my mother was alive because he didn't want to expose his lies. But he'd created a trust, a legal structure meant for his children, plural. And that was the part of the letter that made my hands go cold. Children. The word echoed through my mind like a bell tolling from somewhere far away. I stepped off the train and walked home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood. My apartment sat above a laundromat, the smell of detergent drifting up through the vents. I'd lived there for nearly 20 years, long enough to memorize every crack in the sidewalk outside. When I shut the door behind me, I sank onto the couch and pulled out the key again, pressing it into my palm until it left an imprint. If my father had other children, that meant Ethan wasn't the only one who might feel entitled to whatever was in the trust. I didn't know the rules, didn't understand how any of it worked, but I knew this. My father had built a life full of lies, and now those lies were reaching forward to claw at the edges of mine. I planned to visit the storage unit the next morning, but before I could even gather my thoughts, my phone buzzed. Ethan's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then answered. His voice was tight, impatient. He didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't mention the bill. Instead, he asked if I had talked to anyone at the hotel, if anyone had said anything unusual to me. I told him about Margaret mentioning my father. There was a pause on the line, a pause that didn't feel like surprise. It felt like fear. He told me not to go digging into the past, that it would only hurt me. I could hear Marissa in the background saying something he tried to muffle. When I asked him what he was hiding, he hung up without another word. That silence told me everything. Whatever my father had left behind wasn't just meant for me, and Ethan's reaction wasn't that of a man afraid for his mother. It was the reaction of someone terrified I would reach the truth before he did. I set the phone down, and for the first time since the hotel, a new feeling rose inside me. Not confusion, not shame. Resolve. Tomorrow, I would open that storage unit, and whatever waited inside, I was done letting other people decide which truths I deserved to know. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face at the hotel, the coldness in his expression as he slipped away, and then the stiff pause on the phone when I mentioned Margaret. There was something he knew, something he didn't want me to learn. By sunrise, I'd already decided nothing would stop me from opening that storage unit. The drive to the facility took nearly an hour. The sky was still gray, the kind of morning light that makes everything look washed out. My palms sweated against the steering wheel as I pulled up to a row of beige metal doors lined like soldiers along a cracked concrete lot. I found Unit 114B at the far end, tucked beneath a flickering light bulb. The key my father left fit the lock perfectly. When it clicked open, a strange heaviness settled over me, as if the air itself changed. Inside, the unit smelled faintly of old wood and dust, A single lamp rested on a folding table, its cord looped neatly as if someone had tidied up not too long ago. Boxes were stacked along the left wall, each labeled with my father's handwriting. I took a breath that shook on the way out and reached for the top box. Inside were folders, property deeds, rental agreements, and tax records. My father hadn't been a poor factory worker scraping by like I'd always believed. He had owned 4 rental homes on the east side of Cleveland. The documents showed steady rental income spanning decades, enough money to change our entire lives if we'd known about it. My mother had worked herself sick, and I'd cleaned houses for years, all while he'd kept this to himself. At the bottom of the box, I found birth certificates. One was mine, and the other belonged to someone named Daniel Price. My breathing quickened. Another child, another life my father had tucked away. I opened the next box with shaking hands. Inside were hospital bills, school photos, notes addressed to a woman named Maria. I didn't know her, but her handwriting looked kind. The sort of handwriting that comes from someone who tries her hardest, even when life gives her little. Then I found a folder with thick legal pages clipped neatly together. At the top was the title, Price Family Trust. As I skimmed the summary, my heart began to pound. The trust listed 2 beneficiaries, me and Daniel. The trust also included a clause stating that if either beneficiary were manipulated, coerced, or harmed by someone attempting to interfere, that person could be legally barred from any future claim or benefit. The clause was firm, detailed, and written in plain English my father must have insisted on. I sank onto the cold floor, the papers trembling between my fingers. Ethan must have known about this trust, maybe not every detail, but enough to fear it, enough to do what he did. My hands were still shaking when footsteps echoed behind me. I turned sharply, clutching the folder as if it were a shield. Ethan stood just inside the open door, breathing hard, his eyes wide with something between anger and desperation. He'd driven here fast, so fast he must have left the moment I did. He asked what I was looking at. His voice tried to sound calm, but it trembled at the edges. I held the trust up between us, and the color drained from his face. He stepped closer, telling me I didn't understand, that this wasn't what I thought it was. I asked him how long he'd known about Daniel, about the properties, about any of it. He pinched the bridge of his nose and said he'd found a letter among my father's things years ago, a letter my father must have meant to mail but never did. Ethan claimed he didn't tell me because he thought it would break me. His excuse felt like a slap. He reached for the papers, but I pulled them back. The look that flashed across his face wasn't guilt, it was panic. He told me that if I claimed the trust, everything would go to strangers. He said I didn't need this money, that I'd lived small all my life and didn't understand what power meant. Hearing my own son talk to me like that made something inside me wilt, like a flower crushed beneath a boot. Before I could respond, a shadow filled the doorway. A man stepped in, older than Ethan, tall with grease-stained jeans and a worn jacket. His eyes landed on the papers in my hands, then shifted to Ethan. The man introduced himself as Daniel Price. He said the law firm handling the trust had reached out to him months ago, and ever since then, he'd been trying to piece together why someone kept contacting them, pretending to be a relative. Ethan's shoulders tightened, and he muttered something under his breath. Daniel walked deeper inside the unit, his boots echoing on the concrete. He said he hadn't planned to confront anyone today. But when the law firm forwarded suspicious emails from an account Ethan had used, he realized someone was trying to manipulate the outcome of the trust. Daniel looked directly at Ethan, and his voice carried a weight that made even the air feel still. He said he'd been born into the same kind of neglect I had, raised by a mother who never got help from Harold, a woman who died believing she wasn't enough. He wasn't going to let another generation get swallowed by that same selfishness. Ethan stared at him, jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. I stood between the two of them, the trust trembling in my hands. Part of me wanted to collapse, to scream, to run. But another part, the part that had survived every blow life had thrown at me, kept me upright. And as I looked between my son and the man who shared my blood, I felt the old world inside me begin to crack open. Whatever came next would change everything. I could feel it, and I knew there was no turning back. Daniel stood there with a steadiness that made the whole storage unit feel smaller. The trust papers trembled in my hands, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the shaking came from me or from the storm gathering between the two men who shared the same roof of my past, one through blood, one through birth. Ethan stared at Daniel like he had no right to be in that room, no right to speak my father's name, no right to exist inside a truth Ethan wanted to control. His anger filled the air so thick it felt hard to breathe. Daniel didn't look away. He told Ethan the law firm had already flagged his emails, the ones sent under different names, the ones asking what would happen if I couldn't manage my portion of the trust. He said they knew someone was trying to tilt the outcome, and now they knew who. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. He just turned toward me, as if I still had the power to save him from the very choices he made. He said he had only been trying to make life fair, that he'd grown up watching me scrub floors and live small while Harold hid money that should have been ours. He said he was tired of losing, but the more he spoke, the clearer it became that he didn't see the difference between justice and greed. He didn't see how deeply he'd cut me. He didn't see me at all. I told him I wasn't going to lie for him, not to the law firm, not to anyone. My voice didn't shake. It came out quiet but sharp, like something newly forged. Ethan's expression collapsed into disbelief, then fury, then something almost wounded. He asked if I was choosing Daniel over him, but I wasn't choosing anyone. I was choosing truth. I was choosing myself, maybe for the first time. He left with a threat half-muttered, promising I'd regret this. His footsteps faded down the corridor, and when the door finally closed behind him, a terrible stillness settled in its place. Daniel waited beside me without speaking, giving me space to feel everything: grief, relief, exhaustion, and something like clarity rising through the mess. The hearing took place at the end of that week. I walked into the law office with Daniel beside me. The attorneys listened to everything: the hotel incident, the emails, the manipulation. When it was my turn to speak, I told the truth as plainly as I could. I didn't cry. I didn't hide. I let the weight of Ethan's actions rest where it belonged. Their verdict came quickly. Ethan was barred from any involvement in the trust. The assets were to be divided between Daniel and me exactly as Harold had written. It wasn't triumph I felt walking out of that building. It was something quieter, something steadier, like finding solid ground after years of sinking sand. Daniel walked me to my car. The evening light stretched long and warm across the pavement. He said he hoped we could build something real from here, something better than what our father left us. I told him I believed we could, for the first time in a long time. I meant it.